The United States is waging economic war all around the world. And according to a new report, the US government has imposed sanctions on 1/3 of all of the countries on Earth. And over 60% of poor countries have been sanctioned by the United States. Over 60%. What this shows is that Uncle Sam not only sees himself as the so-called policeman of the world, but really the banker of the world, or the emperor of the world. The US government constantly violates international law because these unilateral sanctions are against international law, and yet the US feels it has the right to meddle in the internal affairs of dozens of countries and try to destabilize their governments, try to overthrow their governments using many different tactics, whether it's outright military intervention, whether it's spreading media propaganda and disinformation, or whether it is economic war, which I'll be talking about today. If you look at a map of countries that are suffering under some form of US sanctions, and almost all of these sanctions are illegal under international law, you can see that it includes many countries in Africa. It includes many countries in Asia. So a huge part of the global south is being targeted by US economic war. And this does not only hurt the governments of these countries, it also hurts the people of these countries. Now in Washington, politicians from both the Republican and Democratic parties claim that their sanctions are targeted against specific institutions, companies, and individuals. But that's actually not what actually happens. In reality, when a country faces sanctions, even if those sanctions are targeted, what happens is that foreign companies and foreign financial institutions don't want anything to do with that country. It doesn't matter if the US government claims there are supposed humanitarian exceptions for food and medicine. That's not the effect. In reality, foreign companies do not want to sell food and do not want to sell medicine to countries that are facing sanctions, which means that average people suffer in these countries. They suffer from economic problems and high rates of inflation. They suffer from a shortage of important imports, especially medicines, medical technologies, and food. So the reality is that US sanctions have literally killed millions of people. I'm not exaggerating. Today, I will be looking at the evidence showing how US economic war is not an alternative to war. In some cases, it is even deadlier than a conventional military war and has led to millions of civilian deaths in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Now, these are facts that independent journalists like me and my colleagues have been talking about for many years, but finally, the Washington Post published a report in July titled "How 4 US Presidents Unleashed Economic Warfare Across the Globe." And this article reinforces many of the things that I've been talking about constantly here at Geopolitical Economy Report. According to the Washington Post, I'm reading, quote, "The United States imposes 3 times as many sanctions as any other country or international body, targeting 1/3 of all nations," end quote. And this article notes that, quote, "By cutting their targets off from the Western financial system, sanctions can crush national industries," end quote. This report includes a chart that looks at the number of sanctions imposed by countries around the world. The United States, as of April 2024, has more than 15,000 sanctions imposed on dozens of countries. The second place is Switzerland, and in third place is the European Union. And Switzerland only has around 5,000 sanctions, which is obviously a lot, but still, the European Union has 4,800. So the US has imposed more than 3 times as many sanctions as even the European Union. Now, in this list, the only institution that has the legal authority to impose sanctions, according to international law, is the United Nations with the support of the UN Security Council. The UN only has 875 sanctions. So the US has 14,000 more sanctions, and those are illegal because they are unilateral. They do not have the support of the UN Security Council. Therefore, they are in violation of international law. And this report also includes a useful chart that shows different countries sanctioned by the US and how severe the sanctions on them are. Now, this table is not exhaustive. There are still many other countries that are sanctioned by the US, but the highest level of severity of the sanctions include Iran, Syria, North Korea, Cuba, and Venezuela. The medium severity include Yemen, Russia, and Afghanistan. The medium-low severity include China, Sudan, Burma, that's Myanmar, Belarus, and Libya. And low severity of the sanctions include Lebanon, Nicaragua, Mali, Somalia, Ethiopia, Democratic Republic of Congo, Zimbabwe, and there are many others. Again, this is only a partial list. This report also has a chart that shows how the number of sanctions imposed by the US has skyrocketed in the past 5 presidential administrations, going back to Clinton and then George W. Bush and the so-called war on terror. The number increased. Then under Obama, it increased again. And under Trump, it skyrocketed in particular with Trump sanctions on Venezuela. And then under Biden, it's just gone into the sky. I mean, it's just sky high. And of course, Biden's sanctions have largely been against Russia, but also against China. So you can see that each administration had their own spree of sanctions. In Bush, it was mostly due to the so-called war on terror after 9/11. And then in the Obama era, he put sanctions on Iran to try to pressure Iran to go to the negotiating table for the nuclear deal. Trump sanctions were largely against Venezuela and also against Cuba, trying to suffocate leftist governments in Latin America. He also sanctioned the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. And then, of course, under Biden, it's with the proxy war in Ukraine and the new Cold War on China, we've seen a massive increase in the use of sanctions. Now, what's also interesting is this article notes how the expansion of US sanctions has led to more and more corruption and has in fact created a kind of cottage industry in Washington. It talks about a multi-billion-dollar industry that has emerged, including law firms and lobbying shops that have emerged in Washington trying to advise the government and also advise private companies and also lobby for foreign governments to try to lift sanctions or try to figure out how to go around US sanctions. And what has happened is that US sanctions have empowered criminal networks and gangs of smugglers. And this has suffocated the economy of countries like, for instance, Venezuela. This is an incredible fact in this report. The illegal US unilateral sanctions on Venezuela have, quote, contributed to an economic contraction roughly 3 times as large as that caused by the Great Depression in the United States, end quote. I need to emphasize this fact. This is remarkable. Imagine suffering under the Great Depression in the 1930s in the US with all of the unemployment and the poverty and the hunger. Well, what Venezuela has suffered because of these illegal US sanctions is 3 times as bad as that. I mean, this is absolutely criminal. Now, what this Washington Post report does not acknowledge is that US sanctions have also killed tens of thousands of Venezuelans. This is according to a report that was published in 2019 by the Center for Economic and Policy Research, a think tank in Washington. This scientific paper was published by the prominent economist Mark Weisbrot and Jeffrey Sachs. Mark Weisbrot said, quote, "The sanctions are depriving Venezuelans of life-saving medicines, medical equipment, food, and other essential imports. This is illegal under US and international law and treaties that the US has signed," end quote. And Jeffrey Sachs, a very prominent economist, said, quote, "American sanctions are deliberately aiming to wreck Venezuela's economy and thereby lead to regime change," end quote. They estimated that more than 40,000 Venezuelans died from 2017 to 2018. Just in those 2 years, 40,000 deaths. And that is a very conservative estimate because in 2020, a leading international human rights expert and former United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights, Alfred de Zayas, he took it further and estimated that US sanctions on Venezuela had killed more than 100,000 people, according to his estimate. That was in 2020. We're now in 2024. The US sanctions continue trying to suffocate the Venezuelan economy, creating a depression 3 times worse than the Great Depression. So even 100,000 deaths is probably still a conservative estimate. Again, sanctions are war. They are not an alternative to war. And by the way, civilian suffering because of US sanctions is not just an unwanted side effect. It is the intended impact. The US government has said this very clearly. There's a famous memo from 1960 that was an internal document published by the US State Department, which has been declassified. And in it, the US State Department talks about ways to try to overthrow the new revolutionary leftist government in Cuba after Fidel Castro and Che Guevara overthrew the right-wing US-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista in Cuba in 1959. In this document, the US State Department acknowledged that a majority of Cubans supported Castro and there was no effective political opposition. Therefore, the US State Department concluded, quote, "The only foreseeable means of alienating internal support is through disenchantment and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship." And the US State Department insisted that, quote, "Every possible means should be undertaken promptly to weaken the economic life of Cuba," end quote. And here's the real money quote. The US State Department said that the US government should carry out actions that, quote, "make the greatest inroads in denying money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government," end quote. That is the goal of US sanctions, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. That's what the State Department admitted back in 1960, and that continues being the US goal in imposing sanctions on so many countries around the world today, especially relatively small countries like Venezuela, like Cuba, like Nicaragua, like Syria. Now, I will talk in a bit here about the US sanctions on Russia and China, which are countries that are actually too big to sanction. And I'll talk about how the abuse of US sanctions is actually leading to the creation of a new financial system and a more multipolar financial order. But we'll come back to that in a second. The point is that for relatively small countries that aren't huge economies like China and Russia, for small countries like Cuba, sanctions have been absolutely deadly and have led to hundreds of thousands of deaths in Venezuela and perhaps millions in Cuba. In fact, the US government did not even hide this fact. Under the Trump administration, a US government official told Univision, he bragged that US sanctions on Venezuela were like Darth Vader's grip around the throat of the Venezuelan economy. I mean, this shows how sadistic and criminal US government officials are. They are comparing themselves to Darth Vader, the imperial villain. And what they're actually acknowledging is that the US is the evil empire from Star Wars. Although actually that is quite appropriate because the creator of Star Wars, George Lucas, actually revealed that the rebels in Star Wars, Luke Skywalker and all of them, they were inspired by the Vietnamese resistance, the National Liberation Front, as it fought against the US empire during the Vietnam War. So I'm actually not too surprised to see today that US government officials are comparing themselves to Darth Vader. They are the evil empire. And what's so sickening is that US governments boast about the fact that they are waging economic war on countries around the world. They think it's funny. They laugh about it. They joke about it. One of the sickening details in this report in the Washington Post is that in 2011, the director of OFAC, that is the Office of Foreign Asset Control, this is the office in the US Treasury Department that oversees sanctions. At a holiday party in 2011, the director of this office overseeing sanctions sang a song making fun of countries sanctioned, and he was singing to the melody of the song by The Police, Every Little Thing She Does Is Magic. He was singing, every little thing we do is sanctions, with the melody, every little thing we do is sanctions, joking about it. He thinks it's funny that the US government is suffocating other countries economically. Well, literally hundreds of thousands of people are dying, if not millions, in Iraq, in Venezuela, in Cuba, in Syria, in Iran, because they can't get certain medicines, because they can't get medical equipment. In fact, another country where hundreds of thousands or perhaps millions of people died because of US-led sanctions is Iraq. And the Washington Post talks about this a little bit, but in a very euphemistic way. In its report, the Washington Post notes that after the Gulf War, the US pushed for comprehensive sanctions that made it impossible for Iraq to export oil or import supplies to rebuild its decimated water and electrical systems, and this led to the spread of illnesses such as cholera and typhoid. Now that is barely scratching the surface of what happened in Iraq. This is such an important historical event that people need to understand. In the 1990s, hundreds of thousands of Iraqis died because of the US-led sanctions after the Gulf War. And this led to, famously, a top UN official resigning and accusing the Western powers of carrying out a G crime. I'm not going to say that word because then this will be censored in the algorithm. But he accused the Western powers of the G crime in Iraq. And who am I talking about? Dennis Halliday. He was formerly an assistant secretary general of the United Nations. He worked at the UN for 34 years, and he was the UN humanitarian coordinator in Iraq. And in his experience in Iraq, he saw so many civilians die because of the US-led sanctions on Iraq in the 1990s that in 1998, he resigned in protest. And he said, quote, "We are now in there responsible for killing people, destroying their families, their children, allowing their older parents to die for lack of basic medicines." Now, more recently, in 2021, Dennis Halliday, this former UN official, did a follow-up interview, and he talked about how decades later, US sanctions continue killing large numbers of civilians around the world. In this interview, Halliday noted that during the Gulf War, which was led by the US and backed by Britain and some European allies, the US bombed Iraq's civilian infrastructure, destroying all of the electric power networks in the country. And he said this completely destroyed the water treatment and distribution system, which depended on electricity. And this drove Iraqis to drink contaminated water from the Tigris and Euphrates. And he said this was the death knell for young children. Furthermore, the US military used depleted uranium, which led to a massive accumulation of nuclear debris, which caused leukemia in children. He recalled visiting hospitals in Baghdad and also Basra and other cities in Iraq, where the hospitals were full of children dying from leukemia. And then he said, furthermore, that Washington and London withheld medicine and medical treatment components that children needed to survive from leukemia. And then he again accused the Western powers of the G crime. And he said that the Western powers were denying Iraqi children the right to remain alive. And he said, quote, "We kill people with sanctions. Sanctions are not a substitute for war. They are a form of warfare." Now, this is not something that we just learned about decades later. It's something that the US government knew in the 1990s And top US government officials justified these crimes against humanity. The most famous example is the former US Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, under President Bill Clinton. She was asked about this in an interview on 60 Minutes, and she was asked if the price was worth it to kill 500,000 Iraqi children. And she said, yes, we think the price is worth it. Watch this chilling clip in which she justifies, this top US official justifies crimes against humanity.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
That video is from 1996, nearly 30 years ago. US governments have known that sanctions are extremely deadly. And not only have they not withdrawn sanctions, they've continued expanding sanctions on countries all around the world. Again, I need to highlight this fact that the Washington Post reported. Quote, more than 60% of all low-income countries are now under some form of financial penalty, end quote. That is US sanctions. More than 60% of all poor countries on earth. And this is economic war against the civilian populations. As I've talked about, the Iraqi children who died, the Venezuelan children who died, the Cuban children who died because of these sanctions, or the children in Iran and Syria and Zimbabwe and the DPRK and so many other countries. They are victims of these sanctions. It doesn't matter if the US government claims that it has humanitarian exceptions or they're only targeted. That's not how sanctions work. Don't just take my word for that. The Washington Post itself, one of the most mainstream US media outlets, acknowledged this. It pointed out that the US government has significant power over the global financial system because the dollar, which it prints, is the global reserve currency, and the US controls international institutions like the SWIFT interbank messaging system, which means the US can try to cut off entire countries from the financial system. The article in the Washington Post notes that the Treasury Department is, quote, the gatekeeper to the world's banking operations, and sanctions are the gate, end quote. So the US Treasury it claims to have the right, of course this violates international law, but it claims to have the right to impose sanctions on any person, any company, or any government around the world. This is a global dictatorship of the US dollar. And the Washington Post notes that for the Treasury, there is no requirement to accuse any foreign company or government official, much less convict them of a specific crime. The US Treasury can say, look, we want to sanction them to destroy their government, and we're going to do it. We're going to try to cut off Iran from the international financial system. We're going to try to cut off Nicaragua. We're going to try to cut off Venezuela or Syria. And that's exactly what they do. They don't have to go to a court. They don't have to accuse them formally of a crime. This violates international law, but of course, the US has veto power over the UN Security Council, which means that the US can break laws every single day and act as a crazy rogue regime and a pirate and steal the assets of countries like Venezuela, steal billions of dollars of gold and foreign exchange reserves. And there are no consequences because the US has paralyzed the United Nations. So as the Washington Post put it, quote, coming under US sanctions amounts to an indefinite ban from much of the global economy, end quote. In fact, the Washington Post acknowledged that the US sanctions on Venezuela were, quote, crippling. And the Washington Post said that the US sanctions resulted in, quote, exacerbating one of the worst peacetime economic collapses in modern history, end quote. One of the worst in modern history. In fact, the people of Venezuela have suffered under a kind of economic crisis that you see in countries that are victims of war, of a direct conventional military war. What this shows is that Donald Trump was waging war on Venezuela. His supporters claim he didn't start a new war. That's false. He was waging a brutal war against the people of Venezuela that killed hundreds of thousands of people. It doesn't matter if he didn't drop missiles. He dropped economic missiles on the economy of Venezuela that killed just as many people as if he were dropping missiles, if not more people. And in this article in the Washington Post, they actually quote a former US government official who oversaw Cuba policy under the Bush administration. This is someone who's a conservative, and he also was a staffer for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He said, quote, "The abuse of this system is ridiculous," end quote. And then he referred to the US government approach as a, quote, "You must sanction everybody and their sister, sometimes literally, system," end quote. That's the system. You must sanction everybody and their sister, sometimes literally. Now, finally, I want to talk more about how the US government's abuse of sanctions around the world has in some ways boomeranged back and is now causing more and more countries around the world to seek alternatives to the US-dominated financial system. The Washington Post acknowledged this. It noted that an existential challenge has emerged because, quote, "If sanctions make it risky to depend on dollars, nations may find other ways to trade, allowing them to dodge US penalties entirely," end quote. And this article cites Obama's Treasury Secretary, Jack Lew, who warned as far back as 2016 of what he called, quote, "sanctions overreach," end quote. And he warned that the overuse of sanctions could, quote, "reduce our capability to use sanctions effectively," end quote. However, what we saw, especially under Trump, which has continued under Biden, by the way, this is bipartisan, Trump massively expanded the use of sanctions. And again, his supporters claimed he didn't wage new wars. That's because he was waging economic wars around the world. Although Trump also continued the war in Afghanistan, continued the war on Yemen, expanded the war in Yemen, expanded the war in Syria, the military occupation of Syria. He boasted of taking Syria's oil. And the Trump administration imposed sanctions on top officials in the International Criminal Court at The Hague because the ICC opened an investigation into war crimes committed by US NATO forces in Afghanistan. This is how much of a crazy rogue regime the US is. And of course, Biden has continued that. And now the Biden administration is threatening to follow Trump in imposing sanctions on the ICC because the ICC applied for an arrest warrant or is going to apply for an arrest warrant against Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu over his crimes against humanity in Gaza. This is the reality of the US rogue regime that is a global dictator that talks about the so-called rules-based order while it imposes sanctions against in violation of international law against 1/3 of the countries on earth and the Hague itself. Now, the boomerang of US sanctions has become so obvious that even some mainstream academics and think tankers who are, neoconservatives and support US imperialism, even they are now acknowledging that US sanctions are backfiring. And this was acknowledged in a new book titled Backfire: How US Sanctions Reshape the World Against US Interests, which is by one of these neoconservative think tankers. And in this book, she admitted that what this means is that the expansion of US sanctions spurs efforts to evade them. States and companies seek ways to circumvent US penalties. She also added, quote, "Sanctions reshape relations between countries, pushing governments that are at odds with the US closer to each other, or increasingly to Russia and China," end quote. So now we see China, Russia, and Iran are close partners, and many other countries are joining in collaborating with them in trade and seeking alternatives to the US dollar and de-dollarization. BRICS is trying to de-dollarize, and dozens of countries across the global south have expressed interest in trying to join BRICS and the BRICS Bank, the New Development Bank, as alternatives to the US-dominated financial system and the US-dominated World Bank and IMF. And earlier I mentioned that while sanctions may be a death knell for small countries like Cuba or Venezuela or Syria, in reality, what we've seen is that some sanctions are simply too big to sanction. And this is the silver lining that I want to end my analysis with today, which is the experience of Russia. Now, the US has put some of the heaviest sanctions in history on Russia, thousands of sanctions. And in 2022, in response to the proxy war in Ukraine, US President Joe Biden claimed that Russia's currency, the ruble, would become rubble. But that's not what happened. And in fact, Russia's economy is too big to sanction, we've seen. And Russia's economy is actually growing faster than any Western economy. And Russia is re-industrializing. There was a very interesting article about this in the Financial Times titled "How the War in Ukraine is Reviving Russia's Rust Belt." What's happening is the Russian government is investing more and more in industrial production, not only because of the war, but because of the sanctions. And what we see is, as the article refers to, a quote, rebirth of manufacturing. And the article says that, quote, this has led to a boom where many expected Western sanctions to deal a painful blow. Russia's economy is forecast to grow at 3% this year, far above the US and most European states. Now, the Russian government has brought back a robust industrial policy providing state support and funding and subsidies for manufacturing. And this has led to reindustrialization of areas that had been industrial hubs back in the Soviet Union. But when capitalism was reimposed on Russia in the 1990s and the horrific neoliberal shock therapy, and literally millions of people died, and entire regions of Russia and the former Soviet Union were deindustrialized, and many people left those areas looking for jobs in the cities. Well, what we now see is that those areas are reindustrializing once again in this Russian government-backed industrialization campaign. And reading here from this article in the Financial Times, quote, some of the most underperforming regions have suddenly started to grow. Manufacturing regions, areas where there is a lot of defense and related industry, the most underdeveloped regions and the low income segments of the population are the ones that are winning. That's where the money is going, end quote. The Financial Times reported that by the end of 2023, industrial output in Russia was up in almost 60% of the country's regions. And this is not just because of the war in Ukraine. Of course, you can have more industrial production if you're making more weapons and ammunition. But this is not just because of that. Russia is also reindustrializing because the Western sanctions on it have basically made it more self-sufficient. And now Russia is bringing back policies that are known as import substitution industrialization, ISI, which used to be very common in many countries before the neoliberal era in the 50s and 60s, in the early 70s. So as an example, the Russian government has in fact nationalized, taken over some of the private factories of foreign car companies and other companies that left Russia because of the sanctions on the country. So what's happened is actually the Russian government has revived some Soviet-era companies, like for instance, a Soviet-era car company, after nationalizing the factories used by foreign car companies. So this is, again, not just because of the war. What we see is that the sanctions on Russia are forcing it to reindustrialize and engage in import substitution industrialization, like countries like Brazil and Argentina tried to do in the 50s and 60s before neoliberalism was imposed on them in the debt crisis in the 1980s. So despite the horrific civilian impact of US sanctions on countries around the world, the one silver lining is I think we've seen the end of the dictatorship of the US controlled financial system. It is becoming weaker and weaker by the month because the US has overplayed its hand. It has abused the US dollar as a weapon and sanctions as a weapon. Russia and China are too big to sanction. They are now creating an alternative financial system. And the US is basically dividing the world, not only politically through its new Cold War, but it's dividing the world economically and financially. And the US and all of its proxies and so-called allies will be forced to use those institutions. And China and Russia and BRICS and the New Development Bank and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and these other Eurasian institutions and Global South-led institutions, the G77 plus China, all of these groups are trying to create alternatives to the US-controlled financial dictatorship. And for countries that are too big to sanction, this has actually helped to strengthen their economic sovereignty. China is making huge progress in advanced manufacturing, in new technologies, in semiconductors and other technologies. And the US response is to tariff them, to prevent its consumers from buying those products. So the US is dividing the global economy. And what this means is that whereas in the past few decades, US sanctions were truly a death knell for relatively small countries, suffocating the people of Cuba, suffocating the people of Venezuela. Now, I think in the years to come, US sanctions will become more and more toothless. They will not be as devastating. And in countries in alliance with China and Russia and Iran and BRICS will be able to pursue their own independent path of economic development. They won't be forced to follow the neoliberal Washington consensus that was imposed on them by US-dominated financial institutions like the World Bank and like the IMF. So yes, we are still in a time in which so many people, millions of people around the world, billions of people are suffering because of illegal unilateral sanctions, which have been imposed on more than 1/3 of countries on Earth, including 60% of poor countries, in violation of international law. But like I said, I think this is actually the peak of this US economic war, which is going to become less and less effective as alternatives are finally created. On that note, I'm going to conclude here. I am Ben Norton, the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. I will see you all next time.